The sun poured golden light through the tall kitchen windows of our home in Portland, casting a warm glow over the worn wooden countertops. I sat at the table, cradling a mug of black coffee, my thoughts swirling in the stillness of the room. Across from me, Isabella, my wife of 7 years, flipped through a magazine, her posture poised and distant. At the other end of the table, Clara, Isabella's 16-year-old daughter from her first marriage, was glued to her phone, her expression a practiced mask of disinterest. At 33, I thought I had a solid understanding of what marriage was supposed to look like, a blend of companionship, shared goals, and the occasional challenge. But with Isabella, things had settled into a routine that felt more like walking on a thin line, teetering between comfort and a growing sense of estrangement. Isabella's past had always lingered in the shadows of our relationship. Her first marriage, to Adrian, had been a storm of chaos. Adrian was volatile, prone to fits of rage fueled by alcohol, leaving scars, emotional and otherwise, on everyone around him. His recklessness ultimately landed him in prison, but not before leaving Isabella and Clara to pick up the shattered pieces of their lives. When I met Isabella, she was a woman in the midst of rebuilding herself. We crossed paths at a gallery opening in downtown Portland, neither of us particularly interested in the art on display. I made an offhand comment about one of the paintings, and to my surprise, she laughed, a genuine, unguarded laugh that cut through the formal atmosphere. That laugh turned into hours of conversation, and within a year, we were married. Marrying Isabella also meant becoming a stepfather to Clara, which I had accepted without hesitation. But Clara had always kept her distance. She was polite but reserved, treating me more like a guest than a parent. At first, I tried to build a bridge, offering to help with homework, planning family outings, but the wall she had built was impenetrable. Over time, I stopped trying to scale it. I wasn't her father, and I respected that, but the lack of connection still stung. That morning, as we sat in silence, the tension in the air felt heavier than usual. Isabella's once vibrant smile had faded over the past few months, replaced by distracted glances and hurried conversations. Her phone, which used to sit forgotten on the counter, was now a constant presence. She would shield the screen from view, her fingers moving rapidly over the keys. Every hushed call, every evasive excuse, added to the gnawing doubt growing inside me. I told myself I was being paranoid, that the stress of life was clouding my judgment. But the signs were there, glaring and unignorable. I had always prided myself on being rational, someone who approached problems with a calm, measured mind. But as the weeks dragged on, I could no longer ignore the possibility that Isabella was keeping something from me. "Anything interesting in the magazine?" I asked, breaking the silence. Isabella looked up, startled. "Oh, no, just fluff. Nothing worth mentioning," she said, her tone breezy but unconvincing. Her eyes darted back to her phone almost immediately. Clara snorted softly but didn't look up from her own screen. I glanced at her, wondering if she had noticed the same changes in her mother. Had she picked up on the late-night calls? The vague explanations for her absences? If she had, she gave no indication. As the clock ticked toward midday, Isabella stood abruptly. "I'm meeting Laura for coffee," she said, slipping her phone into her purse. "Laura?" I asked. I had heard the name before but had never met this mysterious friend. "Yes," she replied quickly. "You've heard me mention her before. We went to college together." Her voice had a defensive edge, and before I could respond, she was out the door. I watched her car disappear down the driveway, the knot in my stomach tightening. Something was off, more than off. And I couldn't ignore it any longer. That afternoon, I wrestled with my thoughts, questioning whether I was overreacting or if my instincts were right. Isabella had always been guarded about her past, particularly when it came to Adrian. I tried to respect that. After all, everyone has things they'd rather leave behind. But this wasn't just about the past. It was about the distance that had grown between us, the secrets she seemed to be keeping, and the tension that now defined our marriage. The thought of betrayal gnawed at me, even though I tried to push it aside. I wasn't the kind of man who jumped to conclusions, but the evidence was beginning to mount. Late-night texts. Sudden absences. Conversations that trailed off when I walked into the room. When Isabella returned that evening, she was unusually upbeat, her smile brighter than it had been in weeks. "How was your day?" she asked, setting her purse on the counter. "Fine," I replied, studying her carefully. "How was coffee with Laura?" "It was nice," she said casually, her tone light. But as she spoke, her eyes flickered away, betraying the practiced ease in her voice. "We talked about old times, caught up on what's new." I nodded, not wanting to press further. But inside, my doubts were only growing stronger. The next day, I made a decision I hadn't anticipated. I called a private investigator. It wasn't something I did lightly. In fact, I wrestled with the idea for hours before finally picking up the phone. But I needed answers. The investigator's voice was calm and professional as he walked me through the process. "What exactly are you looking to find out?" he asked. "Everything," I replied. "Where she goes, who she sees, what she's hiding. I need to know." He assured me that he would be thorough and discreet, and we arranged to meet so I could provide more details. As I hung up the phone, a wave of guilt washed over me. What kind of husband hires someone to spy on his wife? But the guilt was quickly overshadowed by the gnawing need for the truth. The days that followed felt like an eternity. Isabella continued her routine, seemingly unaware of my suspicions. She left the house for her meetings and errands, always with her phone in hand. Clara remained her usual self, quiet, detached, and absorbed in her own world. If she knew anything, she wasn't sharing. Then, after nearly a week, the investigator called. His voice was steady, but there was an urgency in his tone. "I have something," he said. "I think you'll want to see this." We arranged to meet the following morning. That night, I barely slept. My mind raced with possibilities, some rational, others fueled by my deepest fears. I replayed every moment of the past few months, searching for clues I might have missed. By morning, I was exhausted but resolute. The investigator's office was a nondescript building in the heart of Portland. When I arrived, he greeted me with a firm handshake and motioned for me to sit. A manila folder sat on the desk between us, its contents hidden but heavy with implication. "Before I show you this, I want you to know that what I found may be difficult to process," he said. "Are you ready?" I nodded, my throat dry. "Yes." "Show me." He opened the folder, revealing a series of photographs. The first was of Isabella, sitting in a cafe. Across from her sat a man I didn't recognize. He was leaning toward her, his posture familiar, almost intimate. "She's been meeting him regularly," the investigator said, flipping through more photos. "Coffee shops, parks, even his house." I stared at the images, my stomach twisting. "Do you know who he is?" The investigator hesitated before pulling out a clearer photo. The man's face was unmistakable. "It's Adrian," he said simply. The name hit me like a punch to the gut. Adrian. The man Isabella had described as controlling, abusive, and destructive. The man she had supposedly left behind. Yet here he was, sitting across from her, smiling. I sat frozen in the investigator's office, the weight of his words pressing down on me. Adrian. The man who had once torn Isabella's life apart was now sitting comfortably in the middle of mine. The investigator continued explaining the pattern of their meetings, how often, where, and even how long they lasted, but his voice seemed distant. My mind was racing, replaying every recent interaction with Isabella, every excuse she had given. "Are you certain it's him?" I finally managed to ask, my voice barely audible. There's no mistake, the investigator replied. His name is on the lease of the house she's visited. He's still in town, living on the outskirts. I thanked him, though the words felt hollow, and left the office with the manila folder tucked under my arm. Each step toward my car felt heavier than the last. Driving home, I couldn't escape the storm of emotions swirling inside me. Anger. Betrayal. Confusion. How could Isabella have returned to the man who had caused her so much pain? And why had she hidden it from me? That evening, Isabella came home earlier than usual. She greeted me with a smile, though it felt practiced, almost forced. "How was your day?" she asked, setting her purse on the counter. "Fine," I replied, keeping my tone neutral. "And yours?" "Busy," she said with a shrug. "You know how it is. Errands, catching up with friends." I studied her closely, searching for any sign of guilt or hesitation, but her face betrayed nothing. It was almost impressive how effortlessly she maintained the facade. After dinner, as Isabella showered and Clara retreated to her room, I sat alone in the living room, the folder resting on the coffee table in front of me. I stared at it, the weight of its contents suffocating. The images inside were undeniable, the truth impossible to ignore. Yet I still hesitated. Confronting her now, without a clear plan, could backfire. I needed more time to process, to figure out my next move. The next day, I decided to follow her. Isabella left the house around noon, claiming she was meeting Laura for lunch. I waited a few minutes before getting in my car and trailing her at a safe distance. My heart pounded as I watched her drive across town, eventually pulling into a quiet residential neighborhood. She parked in front of a small, unassuming house. Adrian's house. I parked down the street, far enough away to avoid suspicion, and watched as she walked up to the door. Adrian opened it, his posture relaxed, his smile wide. Isabella stepped inside without hesitation. The sight of them together ignited a fire inside me, anger, betrayal, and disbelief swirling into a storm of emotions. I stayed for an hour, waiting to see if she would emerge, but she didn't. The reality of what I had seen left no room for doubt. Whatever her reasons, Isabella was actively choosing to engage with Adrian, the man she had once described as a monster. The man she had supposedly left behind to start a new life with me. When she returned home that evening, I was waiting for her. She froze in the doorway, her eyes meeting mine. The air between us felt charged, heavy with unspoken tension. "We need to talk," I said, my voice calm but firm. "About what?" she asked, her tone light, though her eyes betrayed her unease. I reached for the folder on the coffee table and held it up. "This." Her face paled, and for a moment, she looked genuinely afraid. "Daniel, I can explain." I interrupted, my voice rising. "Explain how you've been sneaking around, lying to me, and meeting with Adrian. The man who ruined your life. The man you said you never wanted to see again." Tears welled up in her eyes, but I felt no sympathy. "It's not what you think," she said, her voice trembling. "He reached out to me. He said he wanted closure, to make amends. I didn't want to tell you because I knew you'd react like this." "React like this?" I repeated, incredulous. "Isabella, you've been lying to me for months. Meeting him behind my back. And you expect me to believe this is about closure?" Her tears spilled over, but I didn't back down. "Do you think I'm stupid? That I wouldn't notice the late nights, the secretive texts, the evasive excuses? You betrayed me, Isabella. You betrayed us." At that moment, Clara appeared at the top of the stairs, her expression a mix of curiosity and irritation. "What's going on?" she asked, her tone laced with annoyance. "Nothing you need to worry about," Isabella snapped, her voice sharper than I had ever heard it. But I wasn't about to let her brush this under the rug. "Actually, Clara," I said, turning to face her, "your mother has been seeing Adrian again." Clara's eyes widened, and for a moment, she looked genuinely shocked. But then, just as quickly, her expression shifted to one of indifference. "That's her business," she said with a shrug. "Not mine." Her casual dismissal stung more than I expected. I stared at her, struggling to process the realization that she didn't care, or worse, that she might have known all along. Isabella's composure began to unravel. She glanced between me and Clara, her eyes pleading. "Please, Daniel, let's talk about this privately," she said, her voice shaky. "This doesn't have to turn into a scene." I crossed my arms, unyielding. "No, Isabella. We're long past that. You made this a scene the moment you lied to me." Her voice broke. "It's not what you think," she whispered. "I never meant to hurt you." "But you did," I said, my voice cold and steady. "And now you need to face the consequences." Clara, leaning casually against the banister, watched the exchange with disinterest. Her lack of reaction felt like a betrayal in itself. I had spent years trying to build a connection with her, but in that moment, it was clear I had failed. "You're going to pack a bag and leave tonight," I continued, my tone resolute. "I won't tolerate this anymore." Isabella's eyes widened. "Leave? Daniel, please, don't do this. We can work through this. I made a mistake, but it doesn't have to end like this." I shook my head, my resolve unshaken. "It's already over, Isabella. You made your choice when you went back to him. Now, live with it." Clara's voice cut through the tension. "So what? You're just kicking us out?" she asked, her tone accusatory. I turned to her, my patience wearing thin. "Your mother's actions have consequences. This isn't about you, Clara. It's about trust, and that trust is gone." Clara scoffed, her indifference giving way to hostility. "You were never really part of this family anyway." The word stung, but I refused to let her see it. "Then it sounds like you won't miss me," I said simply, turning back to Isabella. "You have until tomorrow morning." That night, the house was heavy with silence. I heard Isabella crying softly in the guest room as she packed, but I didn't go to her. Clara stayed in her room, the sound of muffled music seeping through the walls. I sat alone in the living room, staring at the blank television screen, feeling both numb and raw. The next morning, Isabella and Clara left without fanfare. Isabella paused in the doorway, her eyes red and puffy. "Goodbye, Daniel," she said softly. I didn't respond. Instead, I closed the door behind them and locked it. The sound of their car pulling out of the driveway was both a relief and a loss. The following weeks were a whirlwind of legal proceedings and logistical disentanglement. I revoked Isabella's access to our joint accounts and began the process of dissolving Clara's college fund, a fund I had painstakingly built over the years. It felt harsh, but their actions left me no choice. The car I had gifted Clara was sold, and the money reinvested into something entirely for myself. It was a symbolic move, a way to reclaim the energy and resources I had poured into a family that had never truly accepted me. Then, I uncovered more. The investigator provided additional evidence, emails, text messages, even receipts, that painted a clearer picture of Isabella's betrayal. Adrian's re-entry into her life hadn't been recent, it had started nearly a year ago, during one of her so-called work trips. It wasn't a moment of weakness, it was calculated, deliberate. Meanwhile, I began to hear whispers about their life after they left. Adrian hadn't changed. His volatile nature resurfaced quickly, leading to explosive arguments and tension in their home. Clara, caught in the crossfire, reportedly took on a part-time job to help support them. Her dreams of attending college seemed to evaporate as their household fell into dysfunction. Through mutual acquaintances, I heard that Isabella had tried to leave Adrian more than once but lacked the financial means to do so. She called me several times, leaving voicemails that I never returned. Her tone grew increasingly desperate, but I remained firm in my silence. Months passed, and I focused on rebuilding my life. A job opportunity in Bangkok presented itself at the perfect time. It offered a fresh start, far away from the memories of Portland and the life I had left behind. The position was challenging and lucrative, and the idea of immersing myself in a new environment was invigorating. I accepted the offer without hesitation and began preparing for the move. Before leaving, I made one final gesture to sever ties. My lawyer delivered divorce papers to Isabella, along with irrefutable evidence of her infidelity. The terms were non-negotiable. She would receive no alimony, no financial support from me. Clara's college fund was officially dissolved, and the assets were redirected into my own accounts. It was harsh, but I had to protect myself. The trust was gone, and there was no repairing the damage. Arriving in Bangkok felt like stepping into an entirely new chapter of my life. The city's vibrant energy was a welcome distraction from the shadows of my past. I threw myself into my work, focusing on building something entirely my own. For the first time in years, I felt a sense of freedom. The weight of betrayal was still there, but it no longer defined me. Back in Portland, Isabella and Clara were facing the consequences of their choices. Adrian's temper had escalated, and their once idealized life together had crumbled. Arguments turned into screaming matches, and Clara, caught in the middle, bore the brunt of their dysfunction. I learned this through mutual acquaintances, but I felt no sympathy. They had chosen their path, and now they had to walk it. In Bangkok, I began to rebuild not only my professional life but also my personal one. I joined local expat groups, made new friends, and explored the city's rich culture. Slowly, I started dating again. One person in particular stood out, a colleague named Lila, whose warmth and humor brought a lightness to my life I hadn't felt in years. Lila was understanding, never prying about my past, but always offering support when I needed it. With her, I rediscovered the joy of connection, trust, and companionship. One evening, months after I thought I had left everything behind, I received a letter. The handwriting on the envelope was unmistakable. It was from Isabella. Against my better judgment, I opened it. The letter was a mix of apology and desperation. Isabella wrote about how much she regretted her decisions. She admitted that Adrian hadn't changed, that their life together was toxic. She spoke of Clara's struggles and hinted at her own financial hardships. Beneath her words, I could sense a plea for rescue, an unspoken hope that I might swoop in and save her from the mess she had created. I folded the letter carefully and set it aside. My decision had already been made. I wouldn't respond. Isabella had made her choices, and now she had to live with them. My life was no longer tied to hers. As the year came to a close, I stood on the balcony of my apartment in Bangkok, looking out over the city's glowing skyline. The hum of traffic and the chatter of the streets below were a stark contrast to the silence of my past. For the first time in years, I felt at peace. Lila joined me on the balcony, her hand slipping into mine. "What's on your mind?" she asked, her voice soft and curious. I smiled, the weight of my past finally lifting. "Just thinking about how far I've come," I replied. "How everything that's happened led me to this moment." She leaned her head on my shoulder, and together, we looked out at the city, alive with possibility. I knew then that the best chapters of my story were still ahead. The scars from my past remained, but they no longer defined me. I was finally free to move forward, to build a life that was entirely my own.